Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. Merry Christmas. The holidays are almost upon us. At this time of year, I like to pull out all the stops and really wow my guests, and that's exactly what we're doing today in this video. We'll be making this lavish 3D cookie candelabra. It's modeled after an antique marble one in my living room. By the end, hopefully we'll be able to put some candles in it and light it, and it'll look just absolutely beautiful. Now, if you don't want to pull out all the stops and don't have the time to do that this holiday season, this project is definitely scalable and I encourage you to do that. What you might consider is just doing one single cookie piece, like one beautiful element of the base box, along with some of the royal icing holly leaves and pine cones could look absolutely gorgeous. But today we're going to do the whole thing, starting first with the cookies in the project. It's a 21 cookie project with 4 optional cookie feet. So let's talk about what those cookies are. For the cookies, I'm going to be starting from the bottom of the candelabra moving towards the top as we move across the table here. So basically you have about a 4-inch cookie base. This is cut from a custom template, and I'll talk about that in a bit. It's not a standard cookie cutter size. This will ultimately be elevated a little bit on the smaller square so that we can hang some trim at the bottom. And if I don't say all the dimensions here, no worries. I'm going to be putting the dimensions in the video description under the video player. These are the 4 optional cookie feet. They're embossed cookie shapes. The sides of the box, of course, there are 4 of them, and they are composed of 2 pieces each, a 2.5-inch square with a 1.5-inch embossed square on top. This is a molded cookie. All of these unusual parts, the molded pieces and the curved pieces that we're coming to, I will be showing how to make in the next step. This is an internal support. It actually sits on the lid of the box, this piece here, with another dome on top of it to create this understructure beneath the top of the candelabra. This piece is kind of cool because not only is it embossed, it's also curved and cut out. So this will definitely be a piece we want to talk about. Again, the lid of the box, and now we're moving on to the very, very top of the candelabra that sits on top of the box. That's a 6-inch round. I actually trace around a cake cardboard, a standard 6-inch cake cardboard, and use that as a template for cutting. So that's a fairly easy piece to create. On top of that, we're putting more contoured cookie pieces that are also embossed. These are going to be little candle holders. These are about 1 1/8 inch in diameter. I have another version of the candelabra that'll be floating around overhead in photographs that uses slightly bigger cups. I think they're about 1.5 inches. And the size you use will be largely dependent on how big an arrangement you put in the middle of the candelabra. So a range of sizes here will work well. And then for the centerpiece, I've got one other cookie. I used an embossed leaf cookie, which is about 3 inches tall. Another beautiful embossed element is this ornate kind of medallion piece. These are both made with First Impressions molds. I thought this was a little big, but we might try it on the candelabra that we're putting together today. So just different options for the top piece. So that completes the cookie part of this project. I've got a bunch of tools that we'll need to take us through the process from start to finish. So let me clear this off and set those out, and we'll walk through those too. One remark before we move on to the other tools required. I should also say not only is this project scalable, you can just do a few elements of it, one cookie out of the base to make a lavish, beautiful cookie. But I want to remind you that it also serves 2 purposes. I'm using it as the centerpiece in my holiday table, so not only is it decor, but it's also edible. So I don't have to do both dessert and table decor. I've got it all captured in this one project. So just keep that in mind. If it looks intimidating, it's serving 2 purposes. Now, as far as the tools required, I just have the core tools, and as I introduce anything new, you'll certainly see it in the video, and I'll have a comprehensive list underneath in the video description. But basically, to shape some of those unusual molded parts, we're going to need a variety of molds and mats. So for instance, for the little candle holders on top, the dough gets embossed with a sugar veil mat, then cut, and then shaped over a silicone mold, a hemisphere shape, to give it its contour. Likewise, the leaf on top, the square on the sides of the box, and the little feet all use silicone molds. These are mostly First Impressions molds, but again, I'll have the source in the video description. The little dome that forms this under support here is formed very much the same way as the candle holders. The dough is first embossed in this mat, then cut and then shaped over a dome. We're also going to have to cut holes in the center of many of these pieces because I am going to run an internal support through the center of it. We'll need a bit of fondant and another plaque-shaped cookie cutter for creating these corners which hide the seams in the box. And I'll have a pasta machine to roll that out nice and thin. Before we treat, either spray, sponge, or ice the cookies, we want to square off the square cookies so that there's a really nice tight fit. For that, if I'm eating the piece, I'll use a microplane tool, which is a food grade tool. If I'm not going to eat it, sanding paper I will use because it's much faster to file down cookie edges with it. But this is not a food grade material and you want to be cautious about using it on anything you're going to eat. Now, as far as treating the cookies, many are iced. Those that you see white are iced with white royal icing, of course, but there are some other gold cookies out there that have been either sprayed or sprayed and sponged with different edible lusters. So, for instance, the leaf on top, the dome in the center, and the base cookie, and all the cookies actually to start were largely sprayed with gold PME spray so that they have a little gold edge so that they totally reveal gold. Some were additionally sponged with gold luster on top to give kind of a two-tone effect and a little bit more sheen, and we'll get into which of the pieces were treated which way as we get into the video. All of the white iced cookies, namely the box sides, the top of the box, and the round on top, once iced with white royal icing, were additionally stenciled using beautiful stencils from Designer Stencils, and I'll have the names of these and links also in the video description. I used 3 of their stencils, airbrushed them, so you'll need an airbrush for this project, and I used bronze Americolor airbrush coloring for the goldish hue on those pieces. You'll need a stencil genie, potentially for holding some of the smaller stencils in place. We'll otherwise be weighting the bigger ones with magnets and other mechanisms. For the trim pieces on the candelabra, here and also at the very bottom, again, you'll need a little bit of fondant. We're going to be rolling it thin and then stamping it with food coloring. We're going to be using brown liquid gel food coloring, which is the normal coloring I use for coloring my royal icing. It's thicker than airbrush coloring, so it's nice for stamping. We'll be applying it evenly through use of an uninked stamp pad that's never seen anything but food coloring on it. And we'll be using a nice, pretty trim rubber stamp. That's the pattern on it, to create the pattern on the fondant. That's applied with a little corn syrup to the cookie rather than royal icing. And then lastly, we need a bunch of little embellishments to really give it that Christmas flair. I've got royal icing pine cones, royal icing and fondant holly leaves, and little fondant red berries or holly berries. These can also be made with modeling chocolate, which is even more tasty. And when we're all done, we'll be topping it off with little birthday type candles and giving it a light. Now, one note, all of these accessories, I'm calling them, the pine cones, the leaves, and the holly berries, I'm not going to cover in this video. I'll cover them in great detail in a second video. So you'll learn exactly how to make each of those 3 pieces. So let's move on now to how to create some of the unique shapes, the domed and embossed pieces that go into the candelabra. I'm working with my gingerbread dough, but any dough formulated not to spread too much will work well. We want to keep these pieces very, very square, of course. I'm also rolling directly on my silicone baking mat. This is a big piece, and that way I won't have to directly move the cookie off the mat and potentially misshape it. I'll just move the mat directly onto the baking sheet. Now this is a 4-inch square, the base of the box. It's not a standard cutter, so I am cutting with a custom template made with acetate using a big chef's knife and doing single cuts. I find that leaves a cleaner edge as opposed to dragging a paring knife through the dough. Then lift off the template and simply transfer the mat onto the baking sheet and you're ready to go. The other 2 pieces that are going to be cut the same way with templates are the lid for the box and also the under support. Now for the flat embossed pieces. There are 3 different styles: the squares for the sides of the box, the topper, which is leaf shaped, and the optional feet, of which we'll need 4. I'm using a First Impressions mold to create the square, another mold, I don't recall the source, but I'll have a link in the video description, and another first impressions mold for the feet. These molds are oven proof, so I can pack the dough directly into them and bake in the oven, which will leave the best imprint, much better, for instance, than packing the dough, chilling it, and inverting it before baking. Now just pack it in much the same way as you would pack in fondant, as flush to the top of the edge with as minimal overhang as possible. If there's a little bit of overhang of dough, it's not a big deal because we're going to come back and trim these later after they've baked and cooled. Proceeding now to the feet. And again, we'll want to do 4 of these if we're going to use them on the candelabra. Packing just the same way as before. Now into the oven they go, directly in the molds. As I said, they're rather thin pieces, so just watch them carefully. You want them lightly browned around the edges. Once they're out and cooled down is the time to trim. You'll be less likely to break the cookie than you would be if you were to trim them while warm. And I'm just using a tip of a paring knife to chip away any bit of overhang and clean up the design and pattern. So we're doing 2 embossed and curved pieces here, namely the candelabra holders and also that dome that's the internal support. So they have both texture and curve to them. The first thing I want to do is start by rolling out my dough and getting it pretty thin, because the thinner it is to start, the better impression I get in the mat. Then I'll take that. I'm using the Sugar Veil Medallions mat, and I'm going to be picking up that pattern here in the corner. Simply press the dough that we've rolled on top and then roll again. I like to roll until I can almost see the impression of the mat coming through the dough. Very, very thin. Invert it yet again on a well-floured surface and peel away the mat to expose the embossed dough, and now we're ready to cut it for the candle holders. Now we'll ultimately need a hole in the center to receive the candle, which we could cut now. I've used a number 10 tip, I believe, about 1/4 inch in diameter to cut the hole to receive the candle, and now I'm using a 1 1/8 inch fluted round to cut the candle holder itself, dropping it into the mold because I want it to be curved up in the final construction. I do want to elevate it in another cutter to go into the oven to keep it curvy on the bottom. The next shape is going to be shaped, instead of inside the mold, on the outside, because we want this exposed surface up. Just as I did with the flat embossed pieces, I start by rolling the dough relatively thin, about 1/8 of an inch thick, invert it onto a texture mat, press it in, and then roll it until I just see the texture coming through the dough. Now peel away the mat. Don't tug on the dough or you'll tear it. I've got a tear even with pulling on the mat, but we'll hopefully be able to conceal that later. Cutting out now with a 2 7/8 inch round cutter, I believe, though I'll have the exact dimensions in the video description. The next step is to lift it onto the silicone mold to shape it. So this is both embossed and shaped. And gently pat it so that it conforms to the mold. Don't press too hard or you'll press out the pattern. Now my last step is to cut some little scallop shapes at the bottom, and this is where I think I can cut away that tear and even it out. I think that looks pretty good. And I'll just go all the way around here, cutting with a 7/8 inch round cutter. Now I will ultimately need a hole in the center of this as well, but I want it very small just to receive the bamboo skewer that will be the internal support, so it'll be easier to pierce through the dough once it's baked and cooled. The other domed piece that's an internal support is a plain dome shaped over a slightly smaller dome. The process is the same, except I haven't embossed it. One part I want to talk about is the 6-inch round that goes on top. I did cut that using a 6-inch cake pan as a cutting guide. That tends to leave a little rough edge in the cutting process, so I do want to file it back once the dough is baked and cooled, and here I'm using my microplaner, just filing lengthwise along the edge. You'll also want to file all the square pieces in the project, the box sides, the bottom, the lid, all 4 sides. We want this to be tightly fitting and perfectly uniform when we're done. You can also use sanding paper. It's not food grade, however, so do not use it if you plan to eat the project. It's a little bit faster, though, than using the microplaner, so that's the advantage. And they all look great. Now, there are 4 pieces that need to get holes through them that are relatively small just to receive the bamboo skewer that runs up through the center of the project. The candle holders had a bigger hole in them for the candle. So the lid, the 2 domes, and the round need holes in the center. Mark the center on each cookie, pierce it with a trussing needle, which is very, very sharp, and then run the bamboo skewer through it to make sure it's just moving with a little room to spare. Again, mark the center of each piece because we want this all to be lined up and perfectly symmetrical in the end. And once all the holes are pieced in those 4 pieces, do run them up on the skewer to make sure they look centered relative to each other once assembled. Okay, we're moving on to cutting the little corners of the box that are going to go up yonder. And they're a nice way to hide the seams. I've got some pre-cut and I'm indicating what corner of the box they're going to go on because I have a box pre-assembled. Now I'm going to start by rolling the fondant through the pasta machine on my number 3 setting, which is about 1/8 of an inch thick, and then cutting a straight line through it, marking off points that are about 2.5 inches apart because I want my corner piece to be the height of the box, which is 2.5 inches. Now I've got a cutter here from Cookie Cutter Kingdom, and I've got some black markings on it that indicate where I want the cutter to intersect the bottom portion here that I've cut. And I'm going to angle the cutter and create a nice little scalloped shape along the edge, cutting the top here and removing the excess pieces, and I'm left with a perfect corner piece. Now be careful not to move it too much. You'll want to transfer it to a flat surface and then straighten it out before you set it aside to dry. Typically I dry these overnight until they're firm enough to handle and lift without misshaping. And again, you'll want 2 going in one direction and 2 going in another direction so they look symmetrical when put into the box. Okay, so I showed you how to cut all the unusual cookie and fondant pieces, and now I want to talk briefly about how the pieces were treated before the actual decorating of them began. Much of this content I've covered extensively in other videos, namely my dipping video and my outlining and flooding video, so I'm not going to cover those 2 aspects here, but I will show you which pieces were dipped and which were outlined and flooded. Many were first sprayed, though, first with a luster spray, PME Gold Luster Spray, to give highlight to the edges or to exposed cookie parts. Starting first with this dome, which becomes the internal support, this was simply dipped. I did not spray it because it's going to be completely covered with icing. You just want to make sure when you dip that you leave the hole that you bored through the middle open. If it gets plugged, just put that skewer through it again and open it up before the icing dries in the middle. Now, for all the square pieces, I first sprayed them with PME Gold Spray because some of those edges will be exposed and I didn't want to see dark cookie dough. And then I outlined and flooded all the way to the edge in the case of the sides of the box here. The other thing I've done with the sides of the boxes is I fit them all together once they were dry, and I indicated the best fit. And I've marked the bottom of each piece and also the order in which I'm going to arrange it when I put the box together to ensure that these seams are tightest. The other thing I've done is I've mitered the corner at an angle here. Now for the lid of the box, again, it was sprayed with PME Gold first and then iced all the way to the edge, leaving a hole open in the middle because we need to get that skewer through. The base of the box, on which the sides sit, just sprayed. I'm not going to ice it because it will make the box too high. The box is going to sit directly on just this sprayed piece. And remember, we filed all these so they're about as square as possible before we did any spraying or icing. And the top of the box was treated the same way, sprayed and iced. Now, onto the cookies that will be largely uniced. They are all the embossed and textured pieces. I textured them because I really want the texture to show, so naturally we're not going to ice them. The dome was just sprayed with the PME Gold Luster, but the other thing I did to the inside, since this is going to be a support piece, dough when it's not iced isn't as stable or as firm, so I want to make sure that there's more stability to this piece, so I actually iced it on the inside with a little bit of brown icing so it's less likely to collapse. For instance, if it gets humid and this cookie gets soft, this icing will act as a safeguard. So I sprayed it. I also added a little bit of brown beadwork along the edges. We've covered beadwork also extensively in another video. The top leaf was just sprayed with gold on both sides. Candle holders started like this, the plain embossed cookie. I then sprayed it with the PME gold spray on both sides. And then I additionally sponged it with a little bit of edible gold powder extended with some alcohol. Additionally, I piped a little bit of beadwork, little brown dots in the center and white dots along the edge for just a little bit more detail. I'm a more is more person. And then the last embossed piece, the square, this is going to go on a diagonal in the center of the side cookie. To demonstrate the spraying and sponging techniques, I'm going to do that on this last piece because I think some of you would like to see that and may not have seen that in other videos. The luster spray goes everywhere, so be sure to cover your countertops, give it a good shake, and just spray. It's a dull kind of gold color, which is why I like to highlight with luster dust extended with alcohol. Don't mix too much alcohol in because the paint will be too loose and will settle into the recesses. I'm also using a sponge brush and dabbing very lightly, again, to keep just that gold highlight on the very top of the pattern. Okay, so we're now ready to stencil the pieces that have been iced. As a reminder, those are the 4 box sides, the box lid, and also the 6-inch round on top of the candelabra. And I'm using all designer stencils for this. I'll have links to the actual stencils in the video description. One thing I like to do before stenciling on cookies is to test the patterns on paper, cut them to the actual size. And with a project this complex, make sure that they look nice together visually. I wanted a lot of texture and detail here and a mixture of texture, but so that it wouldn't look too crazy, I decided to keep the color all the same across the two. So here's the pattern that'll be going on top. This is the pattern on the lid of the box, and all the sides will get this kind of crosshatch pattern. And the color I'm using just for consistency purposes is Americolor Bronze Sheen to give it a little luster for the holidays. Now for stenciling, I've got this quatrefoil stencil in the Stencil Genie. That's the best way to keep it flat on a cookie this small. This is what I'm headed towards on the side of the box. So I want to bring this down here and orient it about here. And it's still lifting up a little bit on the side, so I'm going to weight it additionally with these rubber molds, and that's going to keep it really flat. One note when working with metallic food colorings, give them a good shake and stir before you start. There's a lot of sediment in them, and if not homogeneous, it can clog the airbrush. When removing the genie, be careful not to jostle it or you can smudge the pattern, but that looks great. Now I'm going to move on to the lid, same process, secure the stencil in the Stencil Genie, lay it on top, and I'm going to additionally weight it with the molds as well. I'm spraying at a 90-degree angle always to prevent underspray and using a little bit more pressure on my compressor because the metallics are thicker and they need a little more force to get them out. Now on to the round that goes on top. This is too big to fit in the Stencil Genie, so I'm weighting it in the middle and also with my trussing needle whenever I'm airbrushing near a particular area. Now to get the center, moving those magnets, and I'm just going to shoot in the center here as well. I'll have links to all these stencils in the video description. They're all designer stencils, and they're just beautiful. With the airbrushing done, we've got some decorating to do. Here's where I'm headed on the box side. The first step is to stick down the embossed square with a little bit of thick Royal Icing glue, and I'll have a link to my recipe and all the consistency adjustments in the video description. Next, I'm sticking down a white Royal Icing transfer in the center. I have a whole nother video about how to make these decorative elements, so I refer you to that. I'm swapping to brown glue now to put down some dragées because the brown glue is less likely to show against the gold cookie as opposed to white icing. And I just want a few around the center transfer for a little extra bling. A very simple gluing and sticking process. Now I want to conceal the gap, if there is any, between the gold cookie and the white cookie, and I'm creating a shell border here using a number 262 star tip, quite small. Once you've piped 2 sides, stick the gold dragée at the corner. Don't pipe all 4 sides and then try to stick the dragées down. I'm using a relatively thick icing and it might dry in the process of piping all the sides and then the dragée won't stick. Now one last detail here along the mitered edges, which will be where the corners are some dots, and here I'm using icing of beadwork consistency. Again, the consistency adjustments will be in the video description. It's a relatively loose icing that forms a nice round bead all on its own. That looks great. We're going to repeat that process along the other mitered side, and that will finish out the box side. You'll just want to repeat that 4 times, or 3 times I should say, for 4 box sides. Let's move on to the leaf. Here I'm sticking down another royal icing transfer so we have some common design elements across the candelabra. I'm anchoring it pretty high though, because ultimately this piece will be plunged into some fondant at the top of the candelabra, and we need to leave a little space for the cookie to be plunged in. Now onto the lid. That's how it looks airbrushed. I'm just going to talk through what I did here. I used a relatively thick outlining icing to create the thin lines because it holds a nice shape, and then my beadwork consistency again for the dots around the perimeter and at the corners. Lastly, the under support. This won't show much, but I'm a more is more person, so I'm going to decorate this too using some outlining icing and just piping a number of radiating lines. I like to elevate the piece so I get a really nice straight line all the way to the bottom and just let the icing drop. I'm going to bisect the dome first, then bisect it again to create quadrants. Note that I'm not piping all the way to the center because that area with the hole will actually be touching the other dome, and if I have too much icing accumulating there, it can interfere with putting the domes together in the end. Now I'd repeat for all 4 quadrants, and you have the finished dome. Okay, we've got our lid and our sides all decorated, and now I want to detail the top piece of the candelabra. I'm not going to put any brown detail work on top because it's going to be heavily covered with the royal icing leaves, pine cones, and the little candle holders. However, I do want to trim out the edge because it does look a little uneven to me, and for that we're going to do a little bit of fondant trim and then accent with white royal icing transfers and as well the brown beadwork that we applied to other elements of the boxes. So the first thing you want to do is make sure it's elevated because we're going to be dropping the trim and we want it to hang as it will in the final construction. Okay, let's start by rolling out the fondant for the trim. I like to start on the number 1 setting. If I try to jam a big blob of fondant through to the number 3 setting, initially it'll just tear the fondant, so I like to advance it through gradually. Now I'm on the number 3 setting and it looks to be a great thickness, about a 1/16 of an inch thick. Just lay it flat and we're going to stamp on it. Here I'm using a trim rubber stamp. It's a little bit more than 3 inches long, so I'm going to have to cut it down a bit and then use it 6 times to get all the way around the 6-inch round. Inking a stamp pad that had previously seen nothing but food coloring, and I'm using the same brown food coloring that I would use to color royal icing. It's a liquid gel food coloring. Pressing gently into the fondant because I don't really want to emboss it. But my stamp fell off my mount. No big deal. I think I'll be able to just lift it up. Yep, that looks great. Now my first step is to cut a straight edge, which is going to go along the upper edge of the 6-inch round. And we're going to be cutting a scalloped edge along the bottom. To do that, I need to also cut a straight line to start and then straighten out that trim piece before I start cutting the scallop. And to cut the scallops, I'm using that same 1/4-inch round tip that we used earlier, just cutting out little chunks as we go. Now to adhere it to the edge of the 6-inch round, I'm using corn syrup, not royal icing. Royal icing can tend to be a little bit lumpy and show more beneath a thin layer of fondant like this, so corn syrup is a little bit better, and it neatly fits between the 2 leaf-like decorations in my stenciled pattern. I just trim it down a little bit and we'll repeat that 5 more times. Okay, so I finished trimming out the edges in fondant. I did that in 6 sections at logical breaks in the stenciled pattern. I've also since added some other details which you all should be quite familiar with, so I'm just going to point them out here. At the seams between the fondant sections, I added one of those little white royal icing transfers that I had sprayed with PME spray, and again I've got a whole nother video about how to make royal icing transfers. And then to make a better connection between the fondant and the cookie itself, I used my beadwork icing again in brown to fill in with a little row of beads around the edge. That also highlights the circular nature of the top and really draws your attention to it. Now these brown spots on top are also royal icing transfers. They're there to serve as little lifts for the cookie candle holders that we're going to put on top. I've got 5 of them glued down already. This was just a gluing process with my white royal icing glue, so I'm going to put the last one on. Again, these were piped about 1 inch wide, 3/4 of an inch wide onto acetate, allowed to dry, and then popped off. In arranging this stuff, I want to make it as symmetrical as possible, so this views well from all angles. And I think that looks pretty good. The other thing you'll notice is now got a skewer in here. This keeps this from sliding off the cake round as I move this around, but it's also valuable because we'll be ultimately arranging the holly and berries on top on a blob of fondant. And I want to make sure I create a hole in that blob of fondant to receive the skewer that's going to be coming up from the bottom of the candelabra. Okay, we're ready to assemble. The first step is to take a little white royal icing glue and pipe it along one of the mitered edges of one of the sides and simply stick the other one next to it. You can see how mitering gives a really tight fit at the corners. Of course, you want to prop it up as you go. The icing is relatively thick and these pieces are pretty small and they're standing pretty well on their own, but just to be on the safe side, I'm propping it both from the inside and the outside. I like to use square blocks because then I can make sure that my box sides, if they're sitting flush up against it, are square as well. Now continue in this fashion, piping thick royal icing glue along each of the edges until you have all 4 sides up. I also like to come back in and reinforce from the inside with more icing, especially as we're not going to see the inside of the box. That just makes sure you're going to have that much more stability to the project. Now before you set it aside to dry, of course, make sure you've cleaned out any excess icing in the seams. We don't want that poking out because we need to fit the box corners there, and reinforce, as I said, as much as possible from the inside. Now we're ready to mount it to the base. I've marked out roughly where it should go with my skewer so that it's centered. You want to do that first and then come back in and pipe white royal icing glue just within that marking so that the icing doesn't peek out too much once the box is in place. Check it now to make sure it's centered all the way around. Now we're ready to trim out the bottom with a border. Again, I'm doing a shell border using that 262 tip that we used around the embossed squares on the sides. I like to bring in similar design motifs throughout the project. The transfers are one, similar pipe borders is another. Now we're ready to elevate it using that smaller square. That's not been decorated because it's not going to be seen. We're actually going to be trimming along the bottom edge of the base so that support will be even more obscured in the final construction. Next, let's stick in the corners just using a little bit of white royal icing glue. You just want to make sure that they point directly out to the corners. So the flat side goes in, the curvy edge pointing out towards the corners. And then the last step is to put the lid on. I'm propping it up on one side with a little bit of fondant because it wasn't perfectly level. Before we put it in though, I want to get a skewer here in place, and I'm sticking it into a blob of fondant in the center of the box. Now sticking down my icing that will secure the lid, and we're going to be threading the lid over this skewer. You could do the project without this internal support, but it's going to stand about 12 to 13 inches tall, and that's just going to give it a little bit more stability. Of course, if you're eating it, you'll need to advise people to remove it before they plunge into the project. Now I'm putting a blob of fondant here underneath my dome. Again, this dome wasn't iced, and that blob of fondant will just be added support there and a preventative to keep that gold dome from potentially collapsing. Gluing on my dried striped hemisphere upside down, and it's fitting nicely because I again left a little gap there around the piping so that there wouldn't be too much icing where it met the gold dome. Reinforcing from the inside with more icing, and now I'm going to hide the seams between the gold dome and the lid with some more royal icing transfers, the same white ones we used earlier. That just gives it a much more finished look. And again, before you set it aside to dry, just check it from all angles. Hi everybody, we've got the base now all mounted and drying, and I'm going to move now onto the top of the candelabra. Remember, it's important to have a skewer now driven through the hole in the top into the styrofoam in the bottom, because I'm going to be planting a blob of green fondant in the middle to receive the pine cones, leaves, and berries, which I'll be talking about in another video. And we need to have a hole under that fondant so that when I take this off this platform and lift it on here, it fits over the hole, or rather it fits over the skewer that's in this piece. So don't forget to put that here before putting the fondant down. Again, choose your best facing front. I like to have 2 of the candle lifts to either side of the dead center so that my arrangement is more visible from the front as opposed to having the candle holder directly in front. So I've oriented it that way. This is my front right here. I'm just going to do half of the pine cone and holly bouquet. The same process would hold for the back of the candelabra. I will put down all the candle holders, and then we'll move forward quickly to mounting it, and I'll talk briefly about how to trim out the bottoms of the elevated base. So let's move forward. Okay, the first step is putting a big blob of fondant on the top to receive the leaf we decorated earlier. And I want this to be pretty tall, the blob of fondant that is, so that I can put a lot of pine cones and leaves underneath it. So I'm just going to stick that leaf in to start, make sure it's not leaning front or back, side to side. And to help with that process, I'm going to lodge a small pine cone in the front and put one immediately behind it to kind of keep that leaf level while the icing is drying. Now it's simply a puzzle-like arranging process where I fit royal icing leaves like this beauty here, pine cones, etc., all the way around to fill in all the gaps and to cover that blob of fondant completely. Again, I will have a whole nother video talking about how to make these very lifelike royal icing pine cones and leaves in a couple of weeks. And they would be fun on any kind of winter cookie, not necessarily just this candelabra. Typically, I like to start with the big pieces first, the pine cones and leaves, and then move to the smaller pieces, the berries and the gold dragées, to fill in the gaps. Now we're ready to put on the candle holders. Again, a simple gluing process, but I'm using brown icing here as opposed to the green I used earlier, just so it's less likely to show against those brown lifts. And the last step is to fill in with some piped leaves using a 349 or 350 leaf tip to fill any remaining gaps that the berries and dragées did not conceal. Once you've allowed the base box structure to dry about an hour, we're ready to mount the top on the base. Apply thick royal icing glue again to the inverted dome, and then simply thread the top onto the skewer, like so. Phew, we're done with the hardest part of the assembly process, which is putting the top on the base, and everything looks great. Of course, I normally would have filled out the whole arrangement behind the top leaf, but we're on video time here, so I'm moving forward, just giving you the gist of each of the steps. One thing I haven't done to this point, as you'll notice, is trim out the base. Here on the candelabra in front, you'll see that I have fondant trim, the exact same trim we used on the top of the candelabra, applied the exact same way. I'm going to go ahead, set this one aside to dry, and bring in another finished piece and just walk you through the trim at the bottom and how you might attach the feet if you want to attach them. So let's talk about those trim pieces at the bottom that I mentioned. First step here was to cut and stamp the fondant just as I did for the top and stick it down with a little royal icing. Then I trimmed out the seam between the cookie and the fondant trim with a little royal icing beadwork. Again, my thin consistency beadwork icing. Next, I came in and embellished the corners with a few gold dragées and additional little pine cones and holly and berries at key junctures along the candelabra. Now, about those optional feet. We've got 21 cookies in this construction so far. If you want to add them, all I simply did was I decorated to this point, then I took a little dab of thick brown royal icing or white royal icing, attached it to the point here, and then glued it down. I tend to like to put the feet down once it's in place on a table because they will touch the tabletop, and in moving the project, you can disrupt the feet. So I would lay those once in place. As far as illuminating it, I cut my hole specifically to fit these little birthday size candles. So if the candles don't sit in there of their own accord, which they might, you can trim them back so they're a little narrower at the base as a first step. And that one stands pretty nicely. If it doesn't feel secure enough to you, then by all means take a little bit of candle wax, ball it up, and stick it into the receptacle or on the end of the candle before plunging it in. I'm gonna go ahead and put all the candles around, light them up, and start my Christmas party. In the meantime, happy holidays and live sweetly.